Okay, I'm in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and I'll be finishing up 1 Corinthians chapter 5 in this message. What's happening here in chapter 5 is that Paul is responding to the situation of there being a guy there in the church who needs to be removed from the church, and the church themselves, they also need to have a little bit of an attitude adjustment. You have a man who has his father's wife, and this is considered to be sexual immorality in violation of Deuteronomy chapter 22 and Leviticus chapter 18. He doesn't quote scripture in order to enforce this issue because it's not really about returning to the law, and that would encourage the people to be thinking about, well, let's go back to the law. It's not about that. It's about living on the basis of what is true and on the basis of reality. Now, in the previous message, I wanted to also emphasize the point that this is not, that the life that we are living is not really about what it is that we do or what we don't do. It is about who we know, is what this life in Christ is mainly about. It's about who do you know? Do you know the living God? Now, through our personal interactive relationship with him, through getting to know him and participating in his life and him participating in our lives and having mutual interaction of him relating to us and helping us to understand the world through his eyes, things like that. Through this relational experience, we will find that there will be a reduction of sin in our lives. Most of the time, it's sins that we would rather he deal with later, and that there are others that perhaps we would like him to deal with right away, and he doesn't seem to be doing. This really is a side effect of the relationship that we have with him, and it is not to be the objective. It is just something that is an extra benefit to our relationship that we have with him through growing to know him as a person. This is the priority. It is to know the Lord. And this is important to see because here at the end of chapter 5, Paul explains that there are some relationships that we perhaps should not have. And you need to keep this in mind, is that this is related to in what ways are we going to contribute to somebody else's life so that they can have an increase in their knowledge of the Lord and their relationship with him. So even though there may be some behaviors that we would consider to be sin, that are sin, even though those sins may be taking place, just as I mentioned with this other fellow, if they would at least acknowledge that it was sin, if they would at least acknowledge that it was wrong, if he would acknowledge that it was wrong, that could be a reason why he could be allowed to stay within the congregation. All right? But when a person denies reality and they deny the truth, then that's something else. There will always be sin in people's lives, no matter who they are. There will always be something. Okay? God has to work with us in the midst of our sinfulness. So also, we are going to have to work with one another and relate to one another in the midst of each other's sinfulness. Otherwise, there will be no relationships with anyone. And so this always has to be a judgment call, to one degree or another. And I would suggest that if this becomes a question, it should probably be addressed first or answered first or worked through first on the basis of in what way are people increasing in their knowledge of God, in their knowledge of the truth? Is that happening in some way? Because if it is, it may not be a good idea to take that away from that person just because of something that's not being addressed right now. Okay, so with that, let me go ahead and proceed into 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. Verse 9 is kind of a follow-up from verse 5. In the previous message, I talked about verses 6 through 8, which is a little bit of an interruption between the two. But here he continues in verse 9 where he says, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. All right, now that could be what he wrote in this letter, in this epistle. Maybe he wrote something else to him. We don't have that much information. But he did tell them not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Verse 10, yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. All right, let me talk about this idea of going out of the world for just a moment. Of course, you're not going to be able to find sinless people in the church, and so we would have to say get out of the world entirely and go to some other planet maybe. And that's not gonna happen. You're not going to be able to do that. And so for you to escape all of these kinds of people, you would have to go out of the world, and you can't, and so you're stuck with it anyway. Another way that this could be perceived is out of the world in the sense of you're going to have to no longer tell lost people about Jesus. Okay? If you're not going to hang out with sexually immoral people, you're not going to be able to be around people who you could tell about Jesus, who could be saved. And that's not going to be a solution. And so for him to say, I don't want you to be hanging out with people who are sexually immoral, and he qualifies by saying those who are in the church who are sexually immoral. Don't be hanging out with them. You can go and hang out with the sexually immoral people who are not part of the church, who are not Christians, who would not be recognized as brethren. You can hang out with them, just not somebody who would be considered to be a Christian. Now, I will say that this to me, as it would be compatible with the first 5 verses in chapter 5, this would mean a brother who is engaged in sexual immorality and who is unwilling to acknowledge that it is wrong. If you have a brother or sister, for that matter, because women deal with sexual immorality also, if you have a person who is a child of God, who is struggling with sexual immorality in one way or another, as long as they're willing to acknowledge that it is sin and that it is wrong, then you should be able to continue to hang out with them, right? Because remember, the objective is not to get all the sin out of a person's life. The objective is to increase their relationship with God, and perhaps you may be able to contribute to that. But if they're not willing to acknowledge the truth, it's unlikely that you are going to be able to contribute to that. If they're wanting to live in denial of reality, you're not likely going to contribute to that. At least with a lost person, you don't have that obstacle. Okay, with a lost person, it's just understood that this is acceptable. There's nothing wrong with this, according to their standards. You have to introduce the truth of God, that this is sin, that this is real, that there is a reality that says that God does not find this to be acceptable behavior. All right? If you have someone who considers themselves to be a Christian and they deny that truth, then there's not much you can do with them. But if they are lost, then there is still some ways that you can contribute to their life. And so this really has a lot to do with recognizing that there are some people with whom you can contribute to their lives and others who you can't. So hang out with those people who you can. And even those who are of the world, who are in the world, who are lost, you'll eventually figure out that you're not going to be able to help this person. Move on. Go find somebody else. Go make new friends. Okay? Don't waste more time than what you or the Lord would find to be reasonable when trying to reach out to those who are lost. Okay, so going back to verse 10, yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. All right, now he adds more to this list than just sexual immorality. That's what he started chapter 5 with, but now He's adding some things. Okay? He's adding some stuff. What are some of these things? With the covetous. Oh, the covetous. Those who covet. Don't hang out with them, right? Don't keep company with them. If you find somebody who's covetous, then no, especially if they're a brother, right? But if they're not a brother or sister, if they're not, a Christian, then if they're covetous, it should be expected. Of course, that's expected. That's who they are. But if they're a Christian and they're covetous, no, don't keep company with them at all. Now, I'm emphasizing this because everyone deals with coveting in some form or another. All right? As long as a person will acknowledge that it's wrong, that it is in violation of the 10th commandment, then you still got something to work with, right? You can still keep company with these people. But when they are not willing to acknowledge the truth concerning coveting, then you're not likely going to contribute to their faith. Go find someone else who you will have a better chance at contributing to their faith. That commandment was the 10th commandment that God was able to present to the children of Israel on Mount Sinai when he presented the law. He set them free from Egypt, all right, and brought them out of slavery, brought them into freedom. The Passover is a commemoration of that. And he started to give them his commandments, and he made it to that one before the people said, go read it. The people said, okay, that's enough. All right? Don't covet. Well, who's going to be able to obey that one? They knew they were not going to be able to obey that one. All right? And so they said, stop there. Stop right there. That's far enough. We're not going to be able to do that. So if there are any more commandments that you've got for us, you go talk with Moses about those, and he'll tell us what you have to say. But from our point of view, we can't make it past that one, and so let's not bother going on any more than that. That's effectively what they communicated to God. They rejected God. They said, we don't want to hear from you anymore. We'll listen to Moses, but we won't listen to you. And so he complied with their request and did not relate to them personally in that way ever again, really, so much. Okay? And so, coveting, right? Do not covet. Everyone deals with coveting in one way or another. You're going to have to distinguish between those who will acknowledge that it is sin and those who won't. Because those who will, they're people who you can still keep company with. They're people you can still relate to. Or extortioners. What does it mean to be an extortioner? What really is that? Okay, well, the definition that I like to apply is that you will do what someone else wants you to do, or they will cause you harm. Okay? This is really popular with children. Children seem to be just professional extortioners. Really early on in life, they seem to have this skill, whereas you will do what they want you to do, or you will suffer. You will. For example, if they want you to give them something that you don't want to give them, well, there could be some wailing and gnashing of teeth. Okay? Wailing in the sense of a lot of crying and screaming, and gnashing of teeth could show up in the context of biting. They might bite you or somebody else. That's a form of extortion. Give me what I want, or I will hurt you in this way. Do what I want you to do, or I will cause you harm. All right? And people don't just outgrow this. They become more sophisticated with this in how they relate to other people. If you were to think about it, I'm sure you could think of a few people who are in your life who relate to you as extortionists. They extort you. You will do what they want you to do. You will give to them what they want you to give to them. or they will find some way to interfere or intervene in your life to cause you harm. That is extortion. Blackmail is similar to that in the sense that first somebody does something wrong, and then you're going to be extorted, or there will be an exposure of the wrong that you committed. That fits more into the category of blackmail. Extortion happens regardless of whether you've done anything wrong or not. They just declare that you have done something wrong. Another way that this shows up is when a person manipulates someone else in a certain way. There's a model, there's an outline for this. First, they want you to feel sorry for them, okay, or sorry for somebody else. Some form of pity, in effect. And if you don't feel sorry for them, if you don't feel sorry for somebody else, you feel bad for others. If you don't in the way that they want you to, well, if you do, then you're going to do what they want you to do in response to feeling sorry for these people. But if you don't, well, here comes the punishment, here comes the extortion. Now they're going to require you or expect you to feel ashamed. Okay? That's what comes next. And they'll say, shame on you for not doing something about this, or for not feeling bad or feeling sorry for so-and-so or for me. Okay, now comes the shame. And the shame is a form of extortion as well. First, it's punishment. But then, now if you won't comply with the shame, that's your chance. You better comply now and do what or this person, this extortioner, wants you to do. And if you don't, well, then comes the anger. Okay, and the anger is going to be a level above just putting you to shame. Not only should you be ashamed, but now I am angry with you. This is the usual model of an extortionist. Okay, so you think about that. Has anybody in your life ever expected you to feel ashamed because you don't go along with how you should feel sorry for them or sorry for somebody else? Have you ever been expected to be ashamed of that? And when you did not comply in a way that they wanted you to, then you got some anger out of them. Then they were angry towards you. They were violent towards you. All right, that's what these kinds of people become. They become violent people. All right, and there's nothing you can do but just protect yourself from these people and get them out of your life, and you get out of their lives as much as you possibly can. This is a way of understanding an extortionist. All right, and it starts out when people were children, and they just become more sophisticated and more skillful at it as adults, because usually the wailing and gnashing of teeth doesn't really fit them very well. So they find other ways of doing that other people will find to be a little bit more acceptable than something like that, although sometimes you get some of that as well. All right, now if you can find somebody who does that in a way that is an issue, because everyone will generally have some of that within the way that they relate to others. If it's present, if it's something that causes a disruption in people's relationships, if they will at least acknowledge that this is wrong, then you may still be able to sustain some kind of a relationship with this person. Otherwise, you're going to find that you're not going to want to keep company with these kinds of people at all. But if you're going to reach out to those in a way that they may believe the gospel, then you have to understand that this is the way that a lot of people that's how they are. That's how they relate to others. And you will have to accommodate that to a certain extent or tolerate that to a certain extent, to at least have access to them to be able to communicate those truths that would change who they are and would change their lives. And perhaps the Lord may speak to them about this one day in a way that they will let these things go, the extortion techniques go. But this is a real dynamic that happens with relationships with people, and it is a way of understanding how and why you can or cannot have an effective relationship with somebody else. All right, what else does he present here? Covetous, extortioners, idolaters. I'm not going to get into the detail of idolatry. We don't see that a lot in our time period right now, but so it is reasonably self-explanatory that you'll have to tolerate some of that. I think you'll find that in some Catholic groups of people that they do have forms of idolatry within their worship, and you may just have to tolerate that in order to have access to them, to explain to them the way of God more accurately. That may very well be the case. Okay, continuing into verse 11. But now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named a brother who is sexually immoral or covetous or an idolater, or, he is now adding a few more things, a reviler or a drunkard or an extortioner, not even to eat with such a person. All right, now what does it mean to be a drunkard? Let's start with that one. A drunkard. How much alcohol does a person need to consume before they are classified as a drunkard? A person can write an entire Talmud on that, on how you would define that, and I don't want to encourage this question to be answered. All right? There's a radio program I did for Living God Ministries, Do Not Do According to Their Takanot. And in that program, I go through all the different layers of law that the Pharisees established. And if we were to have a conversation about, well, how are we going to determine if a person fits into the category of being a drunkard or not, we probably would end up with something like that. And I don't think that's going to help. It's just to understand that if the alcohol is causing a disruption in the relationship to the extent where you are not able to contribute to their faith, chances are it's not going to be a good use of your time to keep company with them or to even eat with them. Just go find somebody else to spend your time with. What about, so that's being a drunkard. We have extortion mentioned there again. What about a reviler? In verse 11, who is sexually immoral or covetous or an idolater, or a reviler. What does it mean to be a reviler? I have a definition here in my notes. Someone who criticizes in an abusive, angry, insulting manner. All right? Somebody who criticizes in an abusive, angry, or insulting manner. Someone who is criticizing. Okay, now this is a tough one, especially for those who are dealing with religious pride. Okay, if you got somebody who is dealing with a profound sense of religious pride, and I explained previously how this can be developed and encouraged, then they're going to be criticizing other people. Okay, they need other people to criticize in order to elevate themselves and to support and even increase their religious pride. Okay, it goes together. And to criticize someone else, there will be usually a response. And the normal response to criticism is some form of defensiveness. All right, and then this leads to other responses, and then it leads to stonewalling, whereas a person no longer engages in a relational context with this other person because they've discovered that it's just not going to help. It's not there. There's nothing that they can do. All right? And it starts with criticism from somebody. Criticism, then defensiveness, and then and then it just goes downhill from there. So if we are going to have relationships with one another, we need to be wise about how we use criticism. Okay? Otherwise, it could be easy to fall into the category of just being a reviler. I revile you with my criticism, in an angry, disrespectful, abusive way. Okay? And that just isn't going to help anything. And so do not keep company with these people, especially because eventually they're going to criticize you. It's just going to be a matter of time. I mean, it's necessary for them to sustain their religious pride and to increase their religious pride. They need somebody to criticize, and if you're there, well, you're going to be the target of that. And they're going to do it in a way that perhaps may be to try to inspire you to become like them and not be so sinful, right? That's usually where it's coming from, but it's completely ineffective when it comes to a relational technique, all right? If you're going to have a relationship with someone who is in the world, who is not a Christian, and they are a reviler, at least you have something to work with. At least you can tell them about Jesus. You can tell them about the gospel. You can tell them about the new covenant. But when you got somebody who's in the church who's dealing with this, and that's how they relate to people, you can't talk with them. Now, I think you need some Jesus in your life. Oh, yeah, you see how a reviler responds to that one. Okay. They're not going to respond very well with that. They're going to say, well, you are the one who really needs more Jesus in your life than I do. It'll start with something like that if you're lucky. All right? There's just nowhere you can go with that. And so move on to somebody else. That's the same solution to what it is that he presents here. Going into verse 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 12. For what have I to do with judging those also who are outside? Do you not judge those who are inside? Well, we do, in effect, judge others who are the ones we are keeping company with. There's no way to avoid that. It's necessary in order to sustain a real dynamic of what the relationship really is. There will be some exercise of judgment, but for those who are not in the church, and also you could consider those with whom we don't have a relationship with yet, verse 13, but those who are outside, God judges. Therefore, put away from yourselves the evil person. Put away from yourselves the evil person who esteems to be a Christian, who is in the fellowship, in the assembly, or in your company, with whom you cannot contribute to their faith because of the dysfunction that exists because of the sin that they are dealing with in the way that they are dealing with it. All right? For those you just put away. But those who are outside, those who are not yet saved, God will be placing judgment on them. In the church, there's no reason for him to place judgment on a person. They have been forgiven. They are made into a new creation. They are a child of God. What's the point of passing judgment or holding a person's sins against them? As long as he can continue to have a productive relational experience with them, then he will do so. And if he can't, he won't. For you, if you can, do so. And if you can't, don't. All right? But in the world, you're going to have people who are struggling with these kinds of issues, and they are going to be unsaved. And so, of course, there is a judgment for them. And the judgment is that they are spiritually dead and they have sin that needs to be forgiven. That's the judgment. Those are the people who he is relating to in that context, that they need to acknowledge the existence of sin so that they can be the recipients of his forgiveness in a way that it's going to be useful in the sense that they will then perhaps surrender to him on the basis of the new covenant, receive the Holy Spirit of God within them to make them spiritually alive so that they can be made into a new creation in Christ Jesus, become a child of God, and now begin a new way of life. All right? That's the judgment of God. All right. That's the end of chapter 5. I'm going to pause here. For those of you who are using this for small groups, I got a question that can facilitate some interesting conversation. In what ways have you experienced extortion? In what ways would you say that people have extorted you or attempted to extort you based on that model that I described of feeling sorry for someone, you are to be ashamed, and then the resulting anger or violence that erupts when you don't comply with the demands that are expected of you. Can you think of any examples that you could relate to when it comes to that way of people relating to one another? And I'll continue into chapter 6 in the next message. Thanks.